In this video, we're trying the new Mugen Brewer from Hario. Welcome, my name is Patrick Rolfe and this is Coffee with April. For this episode, we are testing what for us is a new brewer, the Mugen Brewer from Hario, a collaboration with Tetsu Kasuya, which has done many of them, and we featured some of those collaborations before as well. And there are some really interesting pointers with this brewer, which we want to share. We, as always, want to share both in terms of our feedback of the brewer itself and also how we currently use it in terms of our favorite recipe. But before we move forward, we should go back to Tokyo when I visited Tetsu the last time, and the fact that we did a brewing video together then, and this was quite a few years ago now. And one of the things he actually did in that video was this one pour brew method, which was kind of interesting because obviously he was famous for a multi-pour structure, which he used to win the World Brewers Cup with. And when we saw this new brewer coming on the market, we kind of figured, well, that's really similar to what we actually did back in Tokyo. So we recommend you to go back and watch that video as well. Now, before we continue with our kind of preferred recipe using this brewer, we want to first tell you that we've been through the recipe that they officially recommend, and you can see it here on YouTube as well as a Hario video, where he's dosing 25 grams of coffee to 300 grams of water. He's pushing 93 degrees Celsius water, and he's doing everything in basically one single pour for 15 seconds. And then he wants a drawdown that goes up until 90 seconds, basically. So we tried that recipe. The result that we got was a bit different from what he referenced in the video. We think mainly, obviously, because the grind size is always hard to reference that without knowing microns. We grounded our coffee at 540 microns, and then we try to keep all the variables more or less the same. But the main thing here that differs is if you look at that video, you can see that the coffee is much darker roasted than the coffee that we're using. And that's something that we've been stressing a lot here. Roast degree matters when it comes to flow rate. So if you have a pouring technique like this one, where you pour all the water at the same time, relatively fast, and you're looking for a specific drawdown, the amount of coffee you're using, in this case being 25 grams of coffee, is going to have a massive impact, right? So you want to consider roast degree when you dial in these recipes. So it kind of goes without saying that we actually enjoyed that recipe. We thought it was interesting. We thought we could taste some positives with it. But the strength that we got out of it was a TDS around 1.5, which is a bit too high. Now, obviously, we could change the grind size, change the brew time, and get that TDS down. But there's some other things in that recipe that we think is tasting a little bit too compact for our taste preference. So we kind of recommended, or we ended up doing something a little bit different. That being said, we do really enjoy that initial recipe. It's a great starting point, and it kind of celebrates the unique features with this brewer. Now, looking more specifically at the brewer, basically it's a V60, right? So it's a very similar shape. What is different is the inside. So a traditional V60 more or less has a structure that allows you to have a faster flow rate. And this is based on the rims you see on the inside of the structure, basically, right? Which allows the coffee to spiral it down and therefore go through the coffee faster, the water goes through the coffee faster, right? This one doesn't have that. So it actually designed to have a slightly slower flow rate than what the traditional V60 does. And this is then to counteract the fact that you're pouring all of the water at the same time. Now, furthermore, what they also say in the video is that this brewer doesn't require blooming, which we think is really interesting because we really agree with that, and it goes for all the brewers in the world. Blooming is this very ancient concept of coffee brewing, which is based on a very high amount of CO2 still in the coffee when you're brewing the coffee, and therefore the coffee swells up. And our kind of response to blooming for a long time has been, one, don't brew a coffee with a high amount of CO2 in it, let it degas, right? So if you have a darker roasted coffee, it's going to have a lot of initial CO2, but that's going to disappear quite fast. If you have a lighter roasted coffee, it's going to have less initial, but it's going to take time for it to degas, which is why a roastery that push light roasts often pitches you should rest the coffee for up to 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks before you start brewing with it, right? So the idea of not blooming makes a lot of sense for us. It's something that we've done for a long time. We don't bloom with the April brewer either. Now, when it comes to tweaking our own recipe, what we're ending up with is definitely pouring everything in one go. We're gonna keep the amount of water, 300 grams, but we're gonna use a little bit less coffee. So we're gonna use 20 grams of coffee. So this is still not a very high ratio, it's 1:15, but it is a lot higher than what they're pitching in the video. And that just, for us, basically means a coffee with a little bit more complexity, a little bit more layers. We really want that. We're aiming for a slightly lower TDS, so we have less coffee, but we also have slightly coarser grounded coffee, so go up to around 600 microns. So still a little bit finer than what we're used to, but coarser than what we did in that initial recipe, because we want the TDS closer to 1.3 or 1.25, right? We also taken the water temperature down a little bit. That's just one of the things that I feel we're pouring a lot of water at the same time, so it's a lot of agitation. And we kind of want to soften up the cup a little bit to avoid any kind of harshness in the cup. Now, another thing we're doing is that we're not pouring with a traditional kettle. So we're actually using this kettle instead, which allows us to pour a lot faster, because the restricted flow rate that the fellow kettle has doesn't really allow us to pour 300 grams in 15 seconds. And that's something that we really want to focus on, because that's something that they definitely recommend when using this recipe, right? So obviously you're pouring a lot of water at the same time. You have to be a little bit careful when using a kettle like this to make sure that the final amount of water is actually the right one. But it does allow you to hit the mark within time, which is really cool. So 303 grams, a little bit more, but still within range. And that's basically it with this brewer. There's no additional stirring. There's no shaking. There's no other things, right? Clearly it's Hario wanting to make a brewing concept that is easy to do. Now, obviously you can do this on a normal V60. You don't have to buy a Mugen to be able to do this. But they're kind of trying to introduce a way of brewing coffee that is easier for anyone, basically, right? Which we kind of appreciate, because coffee brewing has a lot of different sides to it, and there's no reason why it couldn't be simplistic to make a really tasty cup of coffee. That's part of why, for example, the April brewer has a 2-pour structure, which is really easy to do, but also then makes a really tasty cup of coffee. So we like when we have that kind of balance. Now, obviously, there's another interesting point with this brewer and this concept, and you see that in their video as well. There's been a lot of discussions about coffee on the walls of the brewer. It's been a lot of discussions about flatbed when it comes to brewing. This is obviously a brewer and a brewing approach that says we don't care about that, right? So you can make a really tasty cup of coffee with coffee on the walls and with an uneven bed, right? Which I'm sure the coffee community online is gonna have a proper filter with, but we kind of agree with that as well. We moved away a long time ago from coffee brewing being some kind of visual aspect, right? So we're not looking for identical, super clean flatbeds. We don't necessarily think that's the tastiest way to brew coffee. So we are kind of happy that Hario is taking a step towards that direction and kind of opening up the possibilities of multiple versions in terms of brewing approaches when it comes to making really tasty coffee. So what we're going to do here, we're going to let this go down. We're going to do a little bit of an evaluation again, do some measurements, come back with some numbers and compare and kind of share our final thoughts with the brewer. The coffee that we're using, which is good for you to know, it's a natural processed geisha coming out of Finca Deborah. The afterglow lots, which we believe are really, really tasty. So yeah, we'll be back in just a few seconds with some more details. So we're back after another test brew, basically. So the measurements we have here is a little bit different from what we had before, right? So we started out using the referenced recipe from Tetsu in the Hario video, and we thought that was great. We just tried to tweak it a little bit to get a bit more of an April experience to it. So we used less coffee. We used 20 to 300. We used a slightly coarser grind size. We moved one step up on our ditting behind us. And we changed the water temperature, just basically lowering it a little bit. But We still kept the 300 grams of water and we still poured everything within 15 seconds, more or less, right? So we ended up with a total brew time of just basically 3 minutes, more or less 100%. We're ending up with a TDS that is definitely lower than what we experienced in the first cup, which makes a lot of sense. It's a coarser grind science, a lot less coffee as well, right? So the TDS here was about 1.25, which often for us is a very good TDS to have, right? So we're quite happy with it. It produced a really clean cup of coffee, a little bit more layered, complex cup of coffee than the alternative of using more coffee. But in the end, we're relatively into it, right? So what we can do here is, for example, we could go a little bit finer on the grind size to just get that TDS up a little bit closer to 1.3. It will take away some of that kind of dryness that we have at the finish. But in general, we're quite happy. It produces a really, really good cup of coffee for the effort you invest, right? So it's a very easy brew method to use, and you get a really good cup of coffee for that effort, right? Which is kind of interesting. Now, of course, you can go in, you can do multiple pours, you can do this and this and that, and then it very easily will become, we would assume, very similar to a V60, right? But I think it's important to understand that they have a vision in mind for this brewer. That's kind of one pour structure, and we think that's really interesting, and we think that's something that you can take on, you know, both exploring more on this brewer, but also on other brewers as well. So we know a lot of you out there have already tried this brewer. We've seen a lot of videos on it as well. We'd love to hear your feedback. Have you tried it? What do you think in general about single pour structures? Do they make any sense? What is your favorite pouring structure, right? So let us know. We're always really happy to take this conversation further. We're gonna go from here and jump on Patreon and have a little bit more in-depth discussions about it as well. With that, we wanna, as usual, thank you for watching and have a great day. We want to give a special thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. It's because of you that we are able to continue to make these videos. And we want you all to feel free to always come with suggestions and ideas on the content that you want to see, because we are doing this for you and because of you. Thank you from all of us here at April.